Hello and welcome. My name is Robert Buckley and I'm Head of Relationship Development at Cornwall Insight. Today I'm joined by my colleague Ed Reed, who is Head of Training at Cornwall Insight. We're here today to have a chat about a very special anniversary that's come up in Cornwall Insight, namely 750 issues of our weekly Energy Spectrum report. For the last 16 years, Energy Spectrum has issued as a weekly every Monday, covering the latest issues in energy policy, regulation, industry structure and markets, and is supported by a comprehensive daily bulletin. Through its pages, Cornwall Insight has tracked developments and is well placed to comment on where we will be going in the future. Today, Ed and myself are going to look back to look forward and pick out some of the big issues that we have reported in Energy Spectrum, some of the big future changes we expect, and how the energy sector may evolve. So we will particularly look back at 15 years of energy policy developments. We will look forward to 15 years of future energy policy, of course, in the light of the Energy White Paper and initiatives issued just before Christmas 2020. And we will consider how long-term energy policy decisions really affect the sector and how many of the dynamics that are playing out today are the consequences of decisions that have been reported in former issues of Energy Spectrum. So, Ed, if we look back to Energy Spectrum 1 and the first issues of the bulletin, what were the big issues in energy policy that we were reporting at the time?
Thank you, Robert, and hello. Glad to be here with you. Yes, I suppose we take a little trip back down to memory lane, looking at some of the early editions of Energy Spectrum. I think it's quite interesting and telling, actually, the subjects that we covered and were concerning the market at the time. Just to sort of paint the picture, I guess, of what was nearly 16 years ago now. We saw the change in trading arrangements. So Better was extended or introduced, which extended the bilateral contract market design template across all of Great Britain after it being introduced originally in England and Wales, 2001, I think it was. So this is the time at which we have the markets that we're now familiar with, the market design we're now familiar with, but also then looking at the policy aspects that were concerning policymakers and the markets as well at that time. I think it was striking. We're talking about how the key programme to support renewables, renewables obligation, were thought to be policies being considered to make it more effective and more efficient. Obviously, something that we're still collectively concerned with today. Security of supply, albeit framed around gas security of supply, was a major issue around 2005 and 6 as well. And again, security of supply is arguably one of those issues that has certainly maybe evolved a little, but hasn't gone away. And interestingly, perhaps, certainly from a personal point of view, smart meters we were covering off 2005. That's quite some time ago, around why the technology was struggling to establish itself and what the benefits could have been for the market and for customers. And I think one eye on the question you posed there, policy decisions made at that point still have an enduring impact on the market and the arrangements we see today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So maybe you could pick out a couple of issues that have changed over time, over these 15 years.
Well, I guess they're still very important issues. On the one hand, security of supply is one we can talk about, and the other one really around smart metering and really the data side of it. But I think turning to security of supply first off, that was in the early years of Energy Spectrum, we were collectively looking at the depleting resources in the North Sea, the need to think about how we change investment structures and regulatory structures to incentivize investment in new infrastructure for importing gas. And actually, over the course of the period we're talking about, that's been one of the examples where
the market's worked, isn't it? Because the investment
absolutely
came forward and gas supplies in a generally very benign international market have not been a problem.
Absolutely, and then perhaps quite unheralded success as well. And I think, it's interesting to see what your thoughts are. But the security supply angle now, I guess we're looking at is much more around the power the power side of the energy mix, dealing with intermittency, I guess, is the key driver there. And
that's right, Ed. And I think you can see that in these 15 years, we've lost the main strategic gas storage asset that we had, rough gas storage, back in 2016-17. Its exit from the market was a very low-key event. And we've not really touch wood. We don't really seem to have noticed it not being there. Such has been the access to global gas markets that we have to date had. And it's quite striking that we've had various looks at whether we should have strategic gas storage in the last 15 years and not taken anything forward. In contrast, on the electricity side, strategic mechanisms to ensure availability of power have become a big feature of the market.
Indeed, with the the capacity market, I guess, is what you're pointing to there. Rob, and I think that is an interesting development at the time, because I think, again, trying to tie this back to the early years of Spectrum and what we've observed over that period, and with one eye on what that means for the coming 15 years, I think it's the role of the state here which has been interesting. So your point around the gas, the way that the challenge of the gas security supply question, I guess, was dealt with, was there was a lot of work done, as we recorded in Spectrum over the first few years of Spectrum, around whether or not it was a government intervention for strategic gas storage, or let the market come forward with solutions. And we landed collectively on the latter. And yet, a few years later, so the early years of the last decade, with the electricity market reform, that we were then reporting on the question, as you say, around, well, what do we do about power security of supply? Is it strategic capacity mechanism? Is it a capacity market? So we've still sort of wrapped the word market around the capacity mechanism, really, that we have in electricity, but it very much is an intervention from the state, I guess, to encourage that security or investment in security. We can argue about the efficacy of the programme, but I wonder now, as we go into net zero, and what your thoughts are on what we've observed as the role of government to bring forward the rules, the frameworks, and maybe even the money to deliver.
Yeah, government has always played a very important role. We changed the electricity trading arrangements in 2001, and then with Better in 2005, in a government-led programme, something that made the New Labour manifestos way back in the day, and that was all about injecting competition into a perceived not very competitive generation market. And one of the things that they did do was they removed the previous capacity payment that there'd been. So in the end, we had about a decade without a formal capacity element in the wholesale power stack before we went back to it. So good example there, Ed, of how policy views change and how they can resonate down the years. A lot of the interventions have been about calling forward investment subsequently, and that has often meant guaranteeing or underwriting costs that the market won't provide in one form or another. We started with renewables. We've gone into capacity now on the generation side, and it's a bit of a truism that people will say that you can't call forward large scale generation without some form of route to market or underwritten cash flow outside the wholesale power cost, because that wholesale market can't send a signal to encourage investment. And when we come to look at the market of the future, the role of the price setting mechanism is going to be a very important question. To what extent can the market provide that investment signal, or have we moved to a world where that signal just cannot be provided by the market and something else needs to step in? And who's going to set the something else, and is the something else going to be not wrong if not right? Big decisions there, and probably presaging a debate we may well be going into about the nature of our wholesale energy market design. We have a bilateral contract market at the moment that was built around competition between big fossil fuel generators designed to drive down the marginal cost. We're going to a world where we will have a lot of very low cost but intermittent generation, so low marginal cost most of the time. Does our market design best suit that? A big question, and one certainly we would expect to come up for consideration in the coming years.
Absolutely, and I think where you're driving at as well, Robert, is that those questions have begun to be asked actually for quite some time, albeit in a relatively quiet voice, if I could put it like that. But I think by which I mean when you look at some of the documents again that we've covered off over the life of Spectrum, and actually are leading, with the benefit of hindsight, quite neatly into the array of documents that were issued more recently around Christmas time. But what I'm saying, I guess, is that we saw Project Discovery,
we did,
which was that was a decade or so ago. But it was even then, they were talking around things like wholesale revenue stabilization mechanisms to encourage investments into low carbon technologies. Well, that looked a lot like a contract for difference, didn't it? As that came out a few years later. Yeah. But even then, I remember setting that. I think it was Ofgem that was setting the scene around 5 models of intervention in the market from, very, what was considered at the time, very extreme and quite not laughable, but sort of approaches to intervention that nowadays we are having more discussions around, as the net zero imperative means that all bets,
indeed, it's quite striking, Ed, that we had the electricity market reform, EMR, approach of a decade ago that did everything but reform the electricity market. It added on a bunch of other interventions on top of the fundamental better market design. Arguably, it allowed the dynamics that's set by the better market to continue. We've now gone to a world where the world that better was designed for is no more. And as you say in the pages of Spectrum, over the last 2-3 years, we've picked up more and more some of the challenges coming forward from some think tanks and from industry itself about the nature of the market design, because in the end the market's about getting best value for producers and consumers. And if we get the market design wrong, that means that either somebody's under earning or somebody's overpaying.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess another one of the areas of policy over this time period, as you mentioned, customers there, and I think smart meters is a good little case study here, is around how technology and interventions into the market to improve customers' information, I guess, should lead to more beneficial outcomes for the market as a whole. But of course, using that smart meter as the nub, I guess, or the hub of driving forward more efficiencies and innovation. I think it's, without being too pessimistic, here we are, 15, nearly 16 years after our first edition of Spectrum, where we're talking about smarter meters, and we're still, as an industry, only part way through the completion of that, and still some way from actually realising the benefits, if they are there to be realised. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting one around increasingly the role of data, isn't it?
It is
in the system, and what role that could and should play. Because I think it's something that it's been relatively recent for the energy industry. Maybe that's reflects poorly on the industry when you think of others, but it's only in the last few years that we've been seriously talking around the role of data, be it personal data or actually more recently system data, again through that lens of improving markets, improving security of supply, and the big policy questions that haven't really they've morphed, they've changed, but they haven't really gone away.
That's right, Ed, and wider attitudes to data, who owns it, so forth, have also changed. And I think the attitude within the energy sector too about what data reveals about consumers has also changed. When we started to talk about smart meters, a lot of effort was put into the benefits that would accrue to individual users from making changes to their consumption. We've also learned that if there are changes to consumption across a system that's socialized, if there are losses that are revealed as a result of consumption changes that others can't adapt to, then I think we've developed a different view as to where the costs of those losses should go. We've got a much stronger view of what fairness is in an integrated sector than maybe we had 15 years ago, after the experience of many years of rising bills. often ironically caused because of rising costs of policy. So it's got a little bit circular. And smart meters, as you say, remain something that's still yet to be properly fulfilled in terms of the gas and electricity sectors here in Great Britain.
Yeah, and I suppose also then let's put the positives on this then, that over the next 15 years, when we'll be having another podcast, Robert, I'm sure in 15 years' time to reflect on how the last these 15 years have gone. That's imperative now then for net zero delivery, I guess. And actually, you just mentioned there talking about gas and electricity markets. I think it's something we obviously as a business and have done in Energy Spectrum. And one of the reasons we launched the sister publication, Energy Net Zero, is how gas and electricity, which was our core focus 15 years ago, is increasingly morphing and changing and coalescing towards e-mobility. We talk about low carbon heat, but we talk about hydrogen. And increasingly, we're doing a number of things along those areas. And I think when you look at what came out from government before Christmas,
we'd hope, Ed, that when we do this podcast in 15 years' time, we will look back on the Christmas of 2020, the spring of 2021, the COP26 summit in November as landmark events in the framing of a fully net zero climate and energy policy. That's certainly the ambition that's set out in the white paper, Prime Minister's 10-point plan, the National Infrastructure Strategy. Very big work programme has been set out of matters to be delivered if even a fraction of those commitments are to be fulfilled. And they're worth turning to in their own right, aren't they, Ed? If we look to where the sector's going to go over the next 15 years, and particularly with how investment's going to be called forward to deliver the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, to deliver the carbon capture and usage and storage clusters, to deliver floating offshore wind and many of the other initiatives that have been set out.
Indeed, and I think I just echo those points. I guess, Robert, is I think it's collectively we understand the scale of the challenge, and I think those slew of documents you've referenced there that came out around Christmas, I think will set the kind of reference point, one of those key turning points in the sector, because as you say, it's all about really the realization that it's not just the level of investment that's required compared to what's gone before. It's staggering, isn't it, when you think about what is required in terms of just bluntly pounds that are required, but equally the technological solutions or the societal solutions which are required, which kind of in some regards make the last 15 years that we've observed, and there has been fundamental change to the sector in terms of how it looks and who's in it and who's no longer in it, but almost makes it look like a walk in the park when we're talking about the types of change there. So I think it will be very interesting.
You are right there, Ed. We have achieved significant decarbonisation of the power system without terribly much fundamental change to the way consumers have used their power. There have been rising costs for the power, that is true, and there have been consequences of those rising costs in terms of fuel poverty and industrial competitiveness. But the fundamental ability of the consumer to switch on or off their appliance as they require it has not been changed. If we go to look at the world of decarbonised heat, decarbonised transport, you'll see that we need much more and different technology to achieve some of these objectives. Some of it will get the consumer's imagination, as EVs seem to be doing, but there will be big hearts and minds challenges on others, particularly around the decarbonisation of heat and weaning the nation off its gas central heating. Will be a particularly big challenge to encourage consumers to pay money to swap out the heat source for perhaps not terribly much, if any, of an improvement in the day-to-day comfort that they enjoy. So consumer engagement and consent and even enthusiasm for this is one of the big challenges. The challenge of hearts and minds is going to be a really big feature of the next 10 to 15 years. It needs to be if we're going to get anywhere near close to our target, and consumers have to want to be able to come on this journey.
Yep, I agree with that, and so it's no mean feat for those that are in places of responsibility to try and make that happen. But of course, We at Cornwall Insight will be there on the journey, tracking it through our publications. They themselves, of course, are going to evolve over the next 15 years.
Indeed,
we very much
a
look forward to going
good
on that
point.
journey.
Well made, Ed. We stand on the point of some very exciting developments within Cornwall Insight in terms of how we offer our insights and our services to customers. Certainly time to watch this space on that one, if nothing else. Well, thank you, Ed, for joining me today in that look back and look forward at the challenges of energy policy as seen through the pages of Energy Spectrum. If you'd like to know more, Energy Spectrum is our weekly insight bulletin, issues every Monday morning, comprehensively covering the latest developments and commentary on policy, regulation, industry structure and markets, the prism of energy policy. Trial subscriptions are available and there is more information on our website.
And thank you, Robert. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. And of course, again, just to remind our listeners that alongside our newsletters that Robert described, we also provide a broad suite of energy markets training. And much of that as well is to help our customers and clients keep track of the emerging net zero transition and what it means for them. So we'll hope to see you virtually or maybe face to face at some point too soon. Thank you.
Thank you.